Hello and welcome back to our last set of slides for COMM 6019. And this is module 2D, and we're going to look at, again, the same material, writing a good business letter, an email, or a memo. So we want to take a look at these ideas. And really, all the ideas fit under this sort of general category of communication theory. This idea of understanding how and why we communicate and the most effective ways to communicate our message to another person. And we want to try to break it down, not into a kind of the DNA of communication theory, but what matters to us as business people and how we can communicate more effectively. Because really that's kind of what it amounts to. So like anything else, the best thing to do is to ask yourself, okay, can I provide a definition of what we are doing, right? We are communicating. What is that? Well, a good definition to work with is that communication is a socio-cultural process. So it involves us as social beings, us as cultural beings, and the process by which we negotiate ideas with one another. Those are differences in power, cultural competency, language competency as well. And we talk about differences in power. We're talking about an underling or a subordinate speaking to a boss, to an area manager, to anyone that is above us in terms of rank when it comes to business. And that's important because we have to address that. And we have to be conscious of the fact that we may be writing to someone who is above our station, as they say. Now, that's not to say that we resent these people, that we harbor bad feelings. No, quite the opposite. We need to acknowledge these differences while at the same time building up our credibility towards them, building a credible relationship, a relationship based on goodwill, one on trust, because without that, it becomes very difficult to build up a business relationship. As much as business is about, moving products from A to B or crunching numbers or whatever, you still have to maintain a degree of credibility and goodwill with and for the person that you are working with. So what that means is when you communicate to that person, you need to be able to maintain that credibility and goodwill so that the message is not only believed, but is acted upon. So that's what I want to look at. Some of the things we may talk about have to do with semantics, right? Choice of language, but it also has to do with the way in which communication is shaped by a lot of things that have little to do with the actual message. So let's take a look at this model here, this communication model, where we have on the one hand, we've got the source, that is us writing the message. There's the message coming through any number of channels. Could be a telephone, could be an email, could be a letter, whatever that channel may be. The message carries on through to the receiver, the reader, the listener, the person to whom the message is directed. Of course, the receiver gets the message, responds to it, thinks about it, acts on it, and it provides feedback back to the source. Now, it looks pretty straightforward, but this thing up here, noise, and it literally means noise. It could be noise in terms of misunderstanding, could be noise in terms of a bad connection, it could be an email that was not sent properly and arrived too late. So it came in, after the act that was required or requested by the source was not acted upon by the receiver. So there's going to be a variety of complications that fall under this general rubric of noise. So let's take a look at this. Okay, so we're talking about business documents, letters, emails, and memos. And when we are looking at how this message goes from the sender to the receiver, what we're doing is a kind of a basic communication theory. And the first things we look at are the various times in which miscommunication may occur. And there is everything from the perception of the message, the encoding of the message, the transmission of the message, right through to the decoding at the other end. And then what kind of feedback it was expected, but what kind of feedback is actually received. So all of these are not sort of hard and fast. They're not etched in stone. These are all the different things that can possibly go wrong, right? And we need to consider that. So we have the perception that we have that the message will be understood by the receiver without any questions. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. How have we encoded that message? Have we encoded it in clear and concise language that the receiver can understand? Or by the same token, is it full of technical jargon and innuendos and insinuations and half articulated ideas that the receiver now has to kind of decode by themselves? It's not clear. And perhaps the message was sent to them via telephone or instant message or email. There's a whole range of things that can make that message become very difficult to understand. Now, there, as I said, also noise. There could be literally physical noise, static on a phone line. There could be, if, let's say, the letter is written. People still do that. They do handwrite letters, and maybe the handwriting is really difficult to understand. So those are pretty straightforward versions of noise. Anything that interferes in the receiving of the message, the reception of the message, is considered noise. Now, there's also psychological noise, right? It could be the fact that the person who's receiving the email, if they know one another, there could be some animosity between them, a bit of hostility between them. Perhaps the person who is writing the message is in a superior position to the one that is receiving, and they're kind of, getting a couple of digs. No, that's very unprofessional. That's bordering on childish behavior. So you don't want to be doing that. But here you are. You're reading this into the message. It may or may not be there. But anything that gets in the way of the reception of the message is noise. And so psychological, some maybe real or imagined power relationship that may or may not be there. It could also be that you've already made up your mind about a particular issue, and the email is asking you to consider it seriously, and please come up with a reasonable suggestion, plan of action or something, but you've already made up your mind. So there's a kind of defense that you've built up against even considering this message. So that again is psychological noise, social cultural noise. That may have to do with, let's say, the fact that the email, otherwise, or the letter, otherwise okay, finishes off with, "Later, baby." What? What did you just write? Later, baby is not what you would be using in a business memo or letter or email. You just don't. And those are more social cultural issues. They have to do with etiquette or netiquette in this case. The person writing just isn't addressing you properly, as a colleague, as an equal, as a subordinate, or as a superior, whatever it may be. Something is not right. And all of that gets into the way of communication, or proper communication, clearly communicating with someone. So we know that various channels, emails are very speedy. An email can be drawn up in no time, sent off to someone, and they can respond to it in a matter of a few minutes. Now compare that to mailing a letter and waiting 4 or 5 days, for them to receive it, then another 4 or 5 days for them to get back to you. Well, a lot of time will have elapsed between you writing that letter and getting some feedback. So oral channels, telephone, speaking to someone face to face is very good. It may be a little bit more accurate in the sense that there is an issue. You can explain yourself right then and there. Now, longer channels, or channels that take a longer period of time, are prone to error, prone to time issues. We want to make sure that if the message is urgent, that you use the vehicle by which that message will get to the other person as quickly as possible. Well, the first one is a phone, right? Pick up a cell phone or a regular phone. You might leave a message. Maybe the message won't be heard. Obviously, speaking to the person face to face is ideal, but that's not always the case. So as much as the message may be urgent, face to face is ideal. Telephone call is the next best. Telephone call, leaving a message, the next best. Sending an email in hopes that they will receive it. There's a lot of different things that are going on, and depending on how important the message is, it can become really difficult to know that that message is going to be acted upon in the time constraint that you've already presented for them. Now, at other times, there may be an issue of too many emails being sent to that particular person, and they're just not paying attention to it. That's called channel overload, right? That's when the message either has gotten through and it's buried along with 15 or 20 other emails that this person has to read every single day or every morning. There could have been a crash somewhere. The email got stuck somewhere on its way from A to B. Because if you've ever sent an e-transfer and the person is on the other end of the line or on the phone, you know that it can take 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 minutes for the message, even electronically, to get from A to B. And there could be a crash in the midst of it. So you don't know. Information overload too, along with a website crash, is simply the fact that the person is just receiving too many messages. Some people, when they get an email, they just answer the first one they see at the top of the list. They work their way through. Well, what if the seventh one is really urgent? You've got to answer that. You've got to respond in the next hour, or else. Well, we don't know how people are responding to their emails. Are they looking at them by way of priority? Some emails, you can actually put an exclamation mark, in fact, a red exclamation mark that indicates clearly to the person that this is important, this is highest priority, urgent, deal with this first. So if that's the case, you might have a chance that that person will read it and will respond to it correctly. So whether it's first come, first served, or it's something else, there's always that possibility that important messages may not be dealt with in due time. Now, miscommunication, as well as the channel overload, the information overload, the noise, right, which is psychological, sociocultural, or actual noise. We have miscommunication that occurs when different people are using different personal, historical, or cultural frames of reference. This is when you start using slang, for example. Slang and jargon is wonderful if you wish to communicate with another person that is on the same wavelength, as they say, right, to use a metaphor. Jargon otherwise is going to literally go over another person's head, especially if you're using jargon that kind of belongs to one culture and using it to speak or to communicate with a person from another culture. Let's say here in North America, we have a lot of sports metaphors. He dropped the ball. He stick handled really nicely through that problem. Sure, if you know basketball, maybe even football, maybe hockey. But what if the person that you are writing to lives somewhere else where cricket is the really popular game, or soccer? And to say stick handle or drop the ball, well, soccer players never hold on to the ball, right? It doesn't make sense. So miscommunication can happen when we're using metaphors that are not understood by the other person. We need to be careful. And this is where semantics, right, really becomes important. So semantics here, we're going to look at just very simple tools that will allow us to overcome some of these barriers that can be there, that sometimes we don't even think about. But no matter what, it will still improve communication. Things like using jargon and metaphors that people do not understand. But if you stop and think about it, you'll realize very quickly that it is possible to continue to communicate with an individual. And it can be in a different part of the world, in a different time zone, coming from a different culture. But as long as you both speak the same language, which internationally is typically English, maybe something else, but let's stick with English right now. Knowing how to write well in English is going to minimize the kinds of problems that you have. Okay, so the first one is the notion that perception involves the perceiver as well as the perceived. And when we look at something, not all of us are going to pick up on the same issues, because what we perceive is also culturally conditioned, right? What we see, what we want to see, what we think is there but isn't there. So not only what we want to see, but seeing what isn't there, and also not seeing what is there. All of those things are culturally conditioned. It may not be a good example, but let's say an example of someone who has lived a really difficult life, they've been living in poverty, and they've not had a whole lot in their lives, and that's their reality, that's their world. and you show a picture to this person, of something is wrong with his house, and what is it? And the answer is it's a broken window. Well, that person is going to see the broken window as being a problem. They may have seen so many broken windows in their lives, if they've even been lucky to live in a house, that they don't look at that as a problem. And you, because you've been really lucky and you've lived, under some degree of affluence, some degree of, sort of living in a comfortable home, for example, and a broken window represents something that needs to be fixed. Well, that's culturally, in this case, economically conditioned. We see certain things as problems or not. So we need to make sure that, when we see something, it's what everyone else sees. Because we have to admit, perceptions may be biased. It may be biased because of a world, a world condition that we have, a cultural condition that we have, any number of things. We need to make sure that we see them the way that others see them. And that's where empathy and sympathy really come into the picture and becomes important. And again, this is something you can apply to everyday life, but most definitely you need to apply to business, because you have one chance to make a good first impression. And if you blow that, right, if you ruin that in some way, it becomes very difficult for the receiver of your message to trust you, to believe that they can have goodwill and they can have cordial relationship with you, because your first impression was not a good one. And it could have been based on a flawed perception of a situation. We need to make sure that we are aware, right, that new ideas, especially when they are presented, if they don't fit, into the worldview of the one you have had all along, maybe it's time to rethink it. Right? Maybe it's, and I hate this metaphor, this expression, you got to think outside the box. But that's kind of what we're saying. Be ready to think outside the box. Think as someone else. Think from another perspective. And if you can do that, you're less likely to come up with this issue that we're talking about, this notion of perception, that it involves a perceiver as well as what is perceived. And consider whether or not you're seeing it the way that other people are seeing it as well. Okay. The second one, and this is also an important one, is the idea that observations, inferences, and judgments are not the same thing. Because an observation is something that can be verified. You can verify it scientifically. You can ask other people if they saw the same thing, and they may or may not have seen exactly the same thing. So an observation is something that can be, it's part of the sense data, right? We look with our eyes, we hear with our ears, and so on. So we can observe. An inference, that's something that you believe to be true, but may not have personally experienced, personally seen, right? So its truth or its veracity, we'll say, as well as its falsity, it can be established, but you're not the one that actually saw it or experienced it. So it's kind of a once removed. So the observation you see directly, you directly observe it. An inference is something that you cannot personally verify, but you can certainly look into it. Is the sun hot? Oh, I'm sure it's very, very hot. It looks like a flaming ball in the middle of the solar system. Have I actually gone up there and touched it? No. But I can assume that it's probably very warm, given what I know of heat and flame, and the fact that the sun's been around for billions of years, and hopefully will be around for, let's say, another 100 years, at least for me. How's that for being selfish, right? But an inference, the sun is hot, is just that. I can't personally prove it, but I can certainly test its validity and see whether or not the statement, the sun is hot, is valid. Well, it turns out it is. Now, a judgment or an opinion, which are kind of the same thing, those can't be verified because it includes subjective ideas, right? An opinion is just that, right? It is what you think about something. It's not an observable fact. It is, in fact, something that has been generated from what you think you've observed. Most likely it's an inference, but a judgment or an opinion is very subjective. So it becomes very difficult to measure to any degree of satisfaction. Judgments and opinions are things we do all the time. We kind of throw them out to people where, in my opinion, I think this, or I think the following. Can we verify it scientifically or in some degree of truth? Not really. So what we call statements are things that all of us can agree to as being true. Now notice that we all agree to. So truths are conditional. Truths are sort of culturally specific. A group of people believe that something is the way it is. And as long as we all agree to it, we say, yes, this is true, right? This is something that we have believed for many, many years. Scientists have been able to prove it to us, or for us, I should say. And as a result, we believe the statement to be true. May or may not have directly observed it, but scientists have. I mean, I don't own a powerful telescope or even a powerful microscope, but I believe that germs exist. I believe that there are microbes and things around. I can't see them, but I believe they're there because scientists have told me we can see them. Okay, so that's where that agreed to notion of truth lies. Okay, 3, no two things are exactly the same. What that means is we need to make sure that when we discuss something that we don't stereotype it. We don't create a kind of a caricature. We try to deal with each thing as a unique entity, a unique moment. So rather than stereotyping it or saying, it's a caricature or it's always been this way, be careful with that because you don't want to start to stereotype something or someone because we don't know. We don't have all the facts. So we have to recognize that there are sometimes differences as well as similarities. That's important. And you want to make sure that the analogy or the metaphor that you use to describe something is accurate and is also appropriate. When you say an expression like life's like a box of chocolates, well, what if someone has never seen the inside of a box of chocolates or has never tried different chocolates? That analogy of life as being like a box of chocolates really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Or, well, I bought a box of chocolates once and they're all the same. So life's the same? I don't get it. So be careful. Be careful when you speak in terms of analogies and metaphors. Now, the sad thing is if you really want to be philosophical about it, all language is metaphorical, right? The fact that we don't have the thing in front of us that we are trying to describe using words, right? That's really the only way we can communicate is using words. Sometimes we can speak face to face and we can correct ourselves, or the receiver can ask a question and we clarify what we're saying. But really, if you want to be sort of technical about it, all language is analogy. All language is metaphor. We don't have the thing in front of us to talk about. And we can talk about things that don't even exist, like unicorns, or things that used to exist, like dinosaurs. So we all have to agree that a dinosaur looks a certain way or unicorns look a certain way. But if we stop and really think about it, there's a lot of things that we talk about that we really don't have directly in front of us, observable. I've never seen a unicorn, but when someone says the word, I know what it means. Now, what that also does mean is we don't want to speak in terms of stereotypes and caricatures, but we also have to be mindful that things change, right? Things literally change over time. And the picture here of what used to be a telephone versus what is a telephone, if you can grasp that, you're doing just fine. The notion of the telephone has changed. It's pretty obvious. Now, when someone cannot recognize that things change over time, if you're the metaphor is an old stick in the mud, right? Or the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. They're all kind of mean the same thing. That there's some people that are so set in their ways that they literally cannot see how things have changed. They might have an old-fashioned dial-up telephone hooked up to a landline, or God forbid, one of these things. They're still telephones. You can still use them. But they're not cool, right? They're not portable. They're not digital, right? You can't walk up and down the driveway and talk to people. So those people that refused to acknowledge the change and development of things are considered to have frozen evaluations. And so a frozen evaluation is basically, an idea that is kind of stuck in time. Now, whether the time is the 1970s or the 1870s is irrelevant. We need to make sure that when we are talking about something, that we talk about it in its most recent, formulation. When we talk about phones, people typically think of cell phones, not some old dial-up thing or some hand crank device. But at one point, that's what a phone was. So right now, when we are talking, we need to make sure that we are clear on what it is we're talking about. When we're talking about a phone, make sure that we all agree this is the phone we're talking about, the iPhone 10 or 11 or whatever the most recent one is. So when you are writing, it's good to be able to date all the documentations, because let's say for the sake of argument, let's say you wrote an email in let's say 2010, and you talked about, the new iPhone. Well, in 2010, what was a new iPhone? I don't even know if there even was an iPhone back then. It's irrelevant. The point I'm making is that if you date documents and you say, the new iPhone, somebody can at least look up and go, well, okay, in 2010, the new iPhone was the iPhone 2. Again, just bear with me here. The point is, when we date documents, when we talk about things being new or things changing, we can at least pin down exactly what was going on. What was the change that these people were talking about? If we don't have any dates on the documents, we have no idea what they're talking about. Or at least, especially if they're talking about something that has changed. What change? Let's say something changes constantly. Which one? Which change are you talking about? Let's say television sets. Television sets 50 years ago, 40, 30, 10, 5 years ago, they've changed dramatically. They're lighter, they're 4K as opposed to an old black and white set with rabbit ears. And yet, we talk about TVs. Well, depending on the age of the person, a TV will look in their mind quite different than what you are picturing in your mind. If you're only 20, your idea of a TV is going to be a wall-mounted 4K, LCD, whatever television, but state of the art. And to somebody who's 70, a TV might be something that they grew up on or with, which was an old black and white box, with a big dial on the front, and only had 10 channels or whatever, etc. Things change. Keep that in mind. Okay. When we are writing to people in a business venture, we want to make sure that we give people options. And one of the ways that we can do that is keeping those options open. The opposite is something like what we have here, where we have what's called an either-or situation. And those either-or situations may not even be legitimate in the sense that, no, there are more than two. So when you are writing to someone and you're giving them options, make sure that you present all of them to people. Now, try not to make it, 27 different things, but let's say 4 or 5. Now, either or implies that there are only 2. So even if you added 1 extra, maybe 2, let's say we made it a maximum of 4 options. Okay, you've now moved beyond the either or simplification. You haven't polarized that person and said, you must choose A or B. You may say, look, you have a series of options in order to, follow through with this particular issue that you have. And of course, it's a business letter, so it is about something that's going on. And you say, okay, here are the 4 different options. And you can sort of list them as little bullet points or number them if you like. Now, be careful when you number things, though, you're implying that number 1 is the best one. So if all of them are valid, what would you do? You would use bullet points. So even unconsciously, when we look at a list, we're implying to ourselves, or we hint to ourselves that, oh, the first one is the best one because it's number 1. So if each one of them is equally valid and equally useful, don't number them. Put a bullet point next to it. Then that way the person reads them and it's just simply a list. Here's a list of 4 different things you can do. Okay, so that's polarizing when you give someone an either-or situation. Do this or this. There are no other options because that may not be legitimate. They could be 3 or 4 or 5 different things they can do. You also don't want to set up a situation where you're asking literally like what's called blindering. You're asking intentionally bad questions to either generate a response that you need or you have formulated the question in such a way that, again, these individuals that are receiving the message have no clear choice, right? You've oversimplified the situation. You haven't given them a third option. You really sort of are cornering them, right? You're cornering that that associate that you're communicating with into really not even choosing anything. The word choice is gone. You must do this. Now, if there is legitimately no choice, then write the email in that way. We have no choice but to do the following, or you have no choice but to follow through with this. If there are options and there are truly choices to be made, indicate that there are, and make it more than two. Because if it is either or, then make sure that there literally is no other option. It can only be plan A or plan B. Okay, the person won't hate you for it, but don't do it illegitimately. Don't try to force a complex situation down to a simple either or, because if you do that, you're going to make it very difficult for that person to build trust and goodwill with you when they may themselves know that there is another option. Now all of a sudden, you've now done something that is just not ethical, we'll say. Okay, when you write something, you want it to be very straightforward. This is from Princess Bride. This is a movie that came out in the 1980s. And it goes, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father, prepare to die." Very simple. Okay, networking success. Polite greeting. "Hello, my name is." You provided the name. Relevant personal link. "You've killed my father." And you managed expectations. Prepare to die. There you go. Literally 4 sentences. And of course, I don't have the proper accent and I'm not about to try that. But it tells us very clearly that sometimes the messages can be clear and straightforward and fulfill all the obligations that a good message has. Okay, number 6, a statement is never the whole story. This is when you start to think about how much information that you need to put into your message so that the person can understand it. Because what happens sometimes is we start to get a little bit verbose. We start providing the background to something, and it's not necessary. Unless that person requires or needs that background in order to make a decision or act upon something, hold back on it. If the person wishes to get more information, let's say the feedback includes, "Could you give me more details? I need more details before I can make a decision." That's perfectly fine. So reports need to be sort of condensed. They need to get to the point. They need to deliver the message without a lot of extra verbiage. And people don't necessarily need to have all of the facts unless they need it. They need those specific facts to make a decision, at which point, yes, they are important. So make sure that when you present or you read through the message and you're ready to present that to another person, read through it and see if you have struck the proper balance between providing enough information for those individuals to make a decision, whether it's to change their minds or follow through with a particular action. You've provided enough, but not too much, right? Because otherwise the email becomes very, very long, and that is not something people want to read. Okay, words, really, it becomes very important in terms, we talked about this before, I think in the last set of slides, we talked about pressure-treated wood rather than arsenic-laced wood, or a used car, versus a previously owned car. So these kinds of words really are loaded. When you say used car, right? They're loaded with a connotation that you may not want to have that person think about. So again, choose your words carefully. In the example here of a work slowdown, right? A recession sounds negative because it is negative. It's a work slowdown. So a slowdown kind of does not indicate the degree to which work has begun to slow down. Is it a drastic recession? Is it a mild recession? Is it deflation? Who knows? But a slowdown is, it's safe, it's generic, and it almost doesn't call attention to itself. If you've ever been at a business meeting, you'll know that group leaders are always fond of saying challenges. We're facing challenges. Really what they're saying is we're facing problems, and lots of them. But a challenge sounds like, I better get my best sword and shield and get out there and slay that dragon. I'm being sarcastic here, but the point I'm making is A challenge is something that can be met and overcome. Problems sounds like they could be nagging problems, long-term problems, problems that cannot be resolved. We don't know. But it's remarkable how our brain will be triggered by certain words, right? Recession rather than slow down. Used car rather than previously owned. So think of your language carefully and make sure that, when you are using the English language and you're communicating with others, or in fact any other language, it doesn't matter if many of you as international students, English is perhaps your second or even your third language. Regardless of the language you speak when you're communicating with another person in a business venture, think about those words and think about how those words might connote something that is connoting something that you don't want that thinker to think about and consider because it may detract from the message. Okay, along with those things where perception is different, words may mean different things to different people, there are also symbols. Symbols that you want to make sure are communicated clearly between the sender and the receiver. And we want to make sure that you minimize the amount of noise. And where you end up having problems, in the same way as you have noise here can be what's called bypassing. And bypassing is when two people, and imagine it just kind of goes whoosh, like this. So the word, which is a symbol, right? All words are metaphors and symbols. Bypassing occurs when two people use the same symbol or the same word, let's keep it simple, to mean two different things. That can happen. If I call my car machine, which is what people used to call a car, it's my mean machine. Some people go, like, do you have like a machine in your house? Do you have like an actual, what is it, like a lathe? Is it a press or something? What is that machine? It's my car, man. Oh, okay. All right. So be careful with that. So make sure that you call that object or that item what it is normally called. Now, again, that follows under jargon and slang. To call something a machine is slang or jargon. But if you're speaking to someone else who knows it, it's not a problem. But you don't know if that person is aware that that word actually means something else. So be sensitive to context, be sensitive to the individuals, consider that other person's cultural or educational background. Try to make sure that you are able to pin down the idea in such a way that the words that you use clarify the key idea that you're talking about. And it's not that difficult. Just stop and think for a moment. Could this word be misunderstood? That's really what you're doing. And then when you ask questions, that's what you're doing. You're asking yourself, could this statement possibly confuse someone? Okay, so that is really about it. And I know we've gone on at length, but hopefully all of this is helpful. And I want to end the last sort of 10 slides or so on direct and indirect structures. We will talk about this in more detail next week, but I just wanted to kind of give you the first indication of it, this direct and indirect approach. So you can present bad news in a direct way because people may want that. Let's say the person you're writing to is very busy and you know they won't read past the second paragraph of an email. They just won't. They're too busy. There, the direct approach is useful for presenting bad news right off the bat, and then the reasons for that bad news and why the situation is the way it is, followed by a positive close. Now, notice how 3 out of the 4 things occur both in the direct and indirect approach. Now you see in this one, the direct approach, the difference is this, the buffer. Because, both direct and indirect have reasons, they have the bad news, and they have a positive close. Where they differ is the buffer. Now, that's what I want to look at. So the buffer is important, and we're going to lead up to that. Okay, so bad news messages can be organized directly and indirectly. So the direct strategy, bad news first, and when would you use that? If the bad news is not significant or it's not truly damaging to that person. Also, too, if the receiver may overlook the bad news. remember, you don't want to bury it in the third paragraph because you're very busy, superior. You know that they don't read past the second paragraph. They just don't have the time. So would you bury the bad news in the third or fourth paragraph? Of course not. You'd put it right up front. So there are times where you can present bad news right off the bat. And these are some of the exceptions. That the news is not, super damaging or significant. That the receiver may overlook the bad news. That the receiver, prefers directness. Get to the point, right? Just the facts, please. Or if it is, let's say, a final notice, let's say, to cut off someone's electricity or their gas or whatever, something serious. If it's a final notice of one sort or another, if you don't pay us this money, we're going to have to go to a collection agency. You don't need the buffer. Get to the point. These people are clearly ignoring you, or they're not realizing the severity of the situation. If firmness is necessary, yes, by all means, do use a direct structure. Okay, now, the indirect structure where you have the buffer, here's where that buffer starts to really be useful. And again, I'm going to introduce the idea and then we're going to unpack it a little bit more. Okay, the indirect strategy is good to present certain types of negative news or bad news when you have the following. Okay, so let's say the bad news is personally upsetting. Let's say it's a layoff notice or someone's been fired, they've been let go. That bad news is really difficult to take. So would you drop that bomb in the first sentence? You could if you don't care. Let's say we are just going to let you know that this plant will close in 6 months and, we just want to let you know. Short, sweet, to the point, but yeah, it still hurts. If the employer cares about the employee, or if you as a sender care about the receiver and you have bad news for them, you can use a buffer when the bad news is either personally upsetting or it's going to provoke a really strong or hostile reaction. If that news may threaten the relationship you've already built up with that customer, and that could be a customer that is both buying the product you're making, or you may be buying a product from another company. Regardless, if that bad news might threaten that relationship, you might want to just back it off and put in a buffer. Or if the news is unexpected. Now, the first and the fourth, the bad news is personally upsetting or it's unexpected, layoff notice or plant closure, those things can be very, very upsetting because it means it's the end of your job. So if the employer cares about their employees, they can tell them, well, after several bad quarters, after a constant decrease in sales or production output or whatever it may be, or financiers are backing out, whatever it may be. But the buffer is the reason for the bad news. And it is important and useful because of the fact that these people need to at least know why that news is there. So what you're doing is you're anticipating the audience's reaction, right? You're anticipating whether or not they're going to be, severely upset, only mildly interested, or something in between. So if that's the case, consider how your audience will react. If it's a minor inconvenience, put it up front. If it's a plant closure or you've been laid off or you've been fired or whatever, use the indirect pattern because it is serious news. It's upsetting news. So you want to make sure that you have some options. Now, even with bad news, yes, direct or indirect pattern. Direct, mild news, not very upsetting. Indirect pattern, serious news, upsetting news, something that is going to change that person's life, right? That's where you want to sort of think about it. Now, again, let's keep working with the direct and indirect structures. If you're using the direct pattern, what you're doing is front loading, and that works best for people that are receptive and open to what it is you want to say. I'm sorry that we will not be able to send this product out. For example, I've received lots of emails from Amazon, for example, for books that I've ordered, from France, which I've done a lot of in the last few years. And because of the pandemic and because of COVID, there are some delays. Delays, crossing the ocean, delays crossing borders. I understand that. So Amazon or whoever else I'm dealing with, will front load their message by telling me there is going to be a delay. We are expecting it to have it here by, this coming Friday. It may be a couple more weeks. We want to let you know. Not the end of the world. So front loaded right there. So that's a direct pattern. It may be bad news, but it's not going to destroy my life. I'm not going to be out of a job because of that. So any of those, any non-sensitive memos, any kind of information that is not going to ruin that person's day, that can be done in a direct front-loading pattern. Okay. Any other kind of non-sensitive topics that I've talked about here, anything that is agreeable to the reader, you can set it up in the following way. So identify the issue briefly. We're sorry to let you know that the book you have ordered that was due, to arrive today has been delayed by a week or two. Identify the issue briefly. Just did. Announce the recommendations or solution concisely using action verbs. We're doing our best to get this book into your possession. We know that the book is presently on its way, so at least it's airborne, right? It's coming from overseas. It's on its way to Canada. Okay, great. Explain the benefits or recommendations necessary to solve the problem. In this case, you don't have to do anything. Just allow us or indulge us the extra few days to get this book to you, and then conclude with a summary or recommendation. You don't have to do anything. In fact, several times I've had the option to cancel the order. Okay, now that is the recommendation or action. Do I want this book? Well, yeah, I do. Am I willing to wait an extra week or so? Of course I am. So I don't go ahead and I cancel it. But even in a simple little message from Amazon about a book being a week or two late, I have the option to cancel my order. So there it is. Short and sweet, direct strategy. It's bad news, but it's not the end of the day, right? Or it's not the end of my life. So that's kind of the way it works. Now, the more difficult ones are the indirect strategy using the buffer. So here's where we talk about the buffer. You want to talk about the problem in very kind of general terms. And you want to sort of slowly work your way towards the specific reasons why you have bad news to tell them. So notice how it's set up. The buffer first. Some kind of positive opening that doesn't reveal the bad news just at this point. So that can be one or two sentences. Let's say a couple sentences, one paragraph. The second one, reasons. An explanation for the causes for the bad news. So you can set up the fact that there is bad news, the reasons why there's bad news, and then finally you drop the bomb, we'll say. It depends on how serious the news is. But the bad news now comes after the buffer and the reasons. So it's actually the third part. So let's say you're writing in terms of paragraphs. The buffer is one paragraph, the reasons is another, the bad news is another, and then a quick close after you've presented the bad news. It is. But what I want you to consider is providing an alternative or a compromise to the person. Now, we won't do this assignment until the end of next week, but I just want to start presenting these ideas. So first paragraph, buffer. Second, reasons. Third, the bad news. Fourth, a close. A positive, forward-looking, pleasant statement after you've presented alternatives to the person. In my case, from Amazon, you can cancel your order at any time, no problem. We are having difficulty bringing this book over to you, but here's what you can do. So that's how you set up an indirect strategy or indirect email using this indirect strategy by setting up the buffer at the beginning, which is the problem sort of written out in general terms. Now, you can put that in the subject line if you like, so that the person at least is alerted that this may not be the news you want, but they've done the work and here is what we found. Then describe the need for the recommendations, if there are any. The alternative solutions, right? Those are the ones you want to think about. So in a couple of weeks, when I ask you to write an indirect bad news letter, think of this structure: the buffer, the reasons, the bad news, and the close. But especially within the bad news, think of the alternatives, right? Some of the recommendations you can offer to the person, there's a list of 4 different things you can do. And then you list those and say the most promising alternative is the following. For me, I could cancel my order, but that was the only option I had. Now, I didn't want to because I wanted the book. So consider that when you're writing these things, because you still want to finish with goodwill. And no matter what form that communication takes, whether it's face-to-face, a phone call, a letter, an email, or whatever, each of those have to be written in this particular fashion so that you have the buffer, the reasons, the bad news, and then still a positive close. So I would recommend, if you have to deal with either HR or you end up in a superior position where you have, underlings, people who work for you, think through your response. If you want to have people feel good about you, even after you've just told them the bad news, take the time to think through it. What could be a buffer that I could start with? What are some of the reasons why the bad news is there? What is the bad news? What are some of the alternatives that I could present? And through those alternatives, end with a positive sense of goodwill. Because you'll find out that if you learn to do this well, that still falls under good communications, because you have considered the receiver of the message. You have considered how those people may respond to your message. Now, if you don't, the cost of bad writing is not only takes longer to read, you need to revise it, your ideas are obscured, you need further information, more emails sent back and forth, and at the worst, it doesn't get the desired result because you haven't written it very well. If you write it and you think about it and you write a draft and maybe improve on it, you'll save time in the long run. You'll make your efforts more effective. Now, it sounds like a bit of a contradiction. I've just said, write it a couple of times. Well, I'm not saving you time. But what happens is you start doing this more and more, you'll start writing a good version even sooner so that your revisions are minor. So the more you do this, the more you take the time to think through your writing, think and write critically, then the less time it will take for you to write a good response and now move into better writing. So communicate your points clearly, build that goodwill. The goodwill is always important. So when we write to each other these days, we tend to use email formatting, and it is very quick and is a very efficient way to communicate with people. But at the same time, we want to make sure we maintain that degree of correctness and quality that written communications have, regardless of how quickly they arrive. Emails are still considered to be, valid ways to introduce yourselves to another person, but take the time to write them well. Take the time to write them in a way that presents you in the best way possible. Also, to choosing the right channels. It may be that a phone call is the best thing because, let's say, if you work with a person and they're there, you've seen them, go and talk to them. Go and talk to them face to face. It's the best way to communicate. The next one is, of course, the next down the list is a telephone call, or person to person. The next one below that is a phone call, leave a message. The person hears the tone of your voice. They can hear that you prepared your response. And that will matter because it will matter in the sense that the person listening to the message knows that you have spent the time thinking it through, that it is prepared, it is concise, it gets to the point. And if it's written, then it uses proper spelling, grammar, and punctuation. You care about your message. So whatever it is, email, text, letter, make sure that you use the appropriate one. Now, you may not have any options because of the fact that you don't see that person. They may be in a different part of the world. And when it gets to global communications, then your hands are tied, right? It's going to be either a telephone call, providing you can contact these people at an appropriate time at the other side of the world, or it's going to be typically emails, right? So emails, text messages may be the best way to communicate with people that, that live in a different part of the world. So when we are writing to people, we need to also remember that the way in which people respond to emails, just like everything else is culturally conditioned, we can't expect everyone to respond immediately to an email. First of all, you might fire one off at 3 p.m, but guess what? It's 3 a.m. in Dubai or somewhere else. So if that's the case, don't start fidgeting and freaking out 5 minutes later that you've not heard from them. For crying out loud, it's a different time zone, right? It's the other side of the world. It's the next day there. So be mindful when you use emails and very quick and rapid, technological devices like that, that you could be sending something to a person that isn't even there. So we need to kind of calm down and just sort of dial it back a little bit. Yes, we give high priority to reading and responding to emails, but we also know that that person is literally not in their office. Or even if you send it to a home email, it's 3 a.m. They're not reading emails, or at least they shouldn't be. So we need to make sure that depending on where you are sending it to it, or who your receiver is, culturally and in terms of time zones, it may be quite different. So no matter what, keep your email etiquette at the top of your mind. Ensure the message is necessary in the first place. Do I even need to write this thing? Keep it to one topic per email. If this is a complex one, send several and break it down. Use a proper subject line that is appropriate and accurate and specific. Choose the proper tone and language and organization of your email message. If you're angry or emotional, do not send your email. Park it, do not send it. Give it a couple hours and read it again and see if you still want to send it. Block capitals, special formatting, enhanced text, keep that to a minimum because you want to make sure that the person that receives it is actually able to read it in the form that you sent it out. They may not have the most recent software. So suddenly a fancy little thing you put in the middle of your email is just gibberish. It's just ones and zeros. Nobody can read it. So if that's the case, be very careful and retain only enough of the original message to aid your reader. So what that means is give the reader enough information so that what you are sending to them makes sense. Do not overindulge them or drown them in information. Just don't do that. Okay, so email etiquette again. Attachments only for heavily formatted or non-text files. If you want to send them a 15-page document, it's an attachment. Tell the reader that you have included this attachment and make sure that you know that they have the software at their end, like a PDF or a document, that they can open it. Open attachments only when you know that person can be trusted, because you don't want to end up with spam or a Trojan or something worse. Forwarding emails, if they're confidential, private, do not do that. Make sure that reply to all in the same way forwarding emails. If they're confidential, be very careful of reply to all. Make sure that you have the legal ability to do so. And if the message is confidential and private, just don't. If I'm not sure, if you're not sure, just err on the side of caution and do not send it until you have the okay from the person who sent you the original message. Emails, you can send them in batches if you want to do that. If you want to CC someone, or if you send a few emails, let people read them. Let people sort of decide what to do about the message that is there. But always, always, always revise, edit, and proofread before sending them. Okay, that's very important because I read my emails and often I forget a word like not. That's pretty important because now all of a sudden I've implied that I will do something or will agree to something when I haven't. So I only end up confusing the person. Okay, so that is the end of our 4 sets of slides in our videos. I'm sorry this one went for an hour. It's a lot of material, but we'll pick this up again next week with fewer slides. We're going to talk about this direct and indirect structure for providing bad news to a person. So we just kind of touched on it for the last sort of 10 or 12 slides, but we'll look at it in more detail next week. So in the meantime, take care and we'll see each other really soon.